Hello everyone, welcome to our channel, a place where shadows come to life through chilling stories that reach me. Today I present another video full of stories sent directly to our virtual inbox. Each text I receive is carefully rewritten by me to ensure that the spirit of terror remains intact, while preserving the identity of those who decided to share their most terrifying episodes with us. Although I respect the testimony of those who send these stories, I must emphasize that I do not have methods to prove the veracity of the incidents. The decision to believe or not is solely up to you. I have been a caretaker for over 9 years. During this time, I have buried many people, witnessed emotional tears, painful goodbyes, and on the other hand, some cold looks from people who only showed up out of obligation. I never paid much attention to what happened outside my duties because my contact was essentially with the dead, not the living. The routine was simple. I did my job, got paid for my work, and moved on with my life. At least, that's what I thought until that late afternoon. It all started on a stormy day, one of those days when the rain never lets up and the overcast sky seems to weigh down on our shoulders. I was preparing the burial of a well-known man in the city, Don Alvaro, who, according to people, had been a successful businessman and owned several properties. But there was another fact that everyone knew about him: his reputation for being absurdly stingy. He was the kind of person who controlled every coin, not letting even the smallest change pass by. As I placed the body in the coffin, I felt a strange curiosity, without knowing exactly why. Maybe it was the uncomfortable silence of that moment, or the way his suit was impeccably ironed. Then I noticed something in my jacket pocket. A small volume, but enough to draw attention. Like an open coffin with no one around, I bent down and reached into that pocket. To my surprise, it was a brand new $100 bill, as if it had come straight from the bank. I looked around, making sure I was alone. The wind swayed the branches of the trees while the cold rain ran down my face. Amidst that scene, a quick thought crossed my mind. He won't miss that money. It was a simple, almost rational conclusion. After all, the man was dead, and no one would notice the absence of a single bill. Before guilt or fear could make me back away, I quickly stuffed the money into my pocket, like someone who commits a crime and hopes not to be discovered. Little did I know that at that moment, I was making a decision that would change the course of my life forever. So that same night, I decided to celebrate this unusual luck. It had been a long time since I had some extra money to spend freely, and that note seemed like a perfect opportunity for some leisure. I headed to the local tavern, a simple and welcoming place where I used to have a beer or two when my pocket allowed. I ordered a generous round of ice-cold drinks, as well as some fatty snacks, and sat down in a discreet corner. I relaxed, feeling for the first time in centuries like someone who could enjoy life without looking back. As I munched on snacks and chatted with the barkeep about the town's football team, I felt no remorse whatsoever about the money I had taken. In the end, as I convinced myself, man no longer needed this. When I went to pay, I took the note out of my pocket and handed it to the innkeeper, feeling a slight sense of pride. It felt like I had won the lottery, a hidden gift that no one would ever know where it came from. But it was the next day that things began to take a sinister turn. When I put on my uniform, I noticed something in my pocket. I put my hand inside, and to my surprise, I was again looking at the same $100 note, intact. I picked it up by the ends and saw that it had the same mark that I had noticed the day before. It defied all logic, for I distinctly remembered handing over the money at the tavern and receiving my change. But there it was, back in my hands. I was bewildered. Hadn't I spent the entire amount the night before? I tried to look for explanations, but nothing seemed coherent. I ended up, however, choosing to take advantage of the note once again. That same day, I went to the market to buy everything I needed: rice, meat, coffee, and even a packet of flour that my wife had been asking for a while. I took the opportunity to pay my overdue electricity bill, and on impulse, I bought a construction set for my niece, who has always loved these games. When I got home, I put the bags on the table and sighed in relief. It was as if that money was miraculously meeting all my needs. The next day, however, there was the note again, resting in the same pocket, folded in the same way. At first, I laughed nervously, even finding it funny. I wondered if I was dreaming or if someone was playing a trick, but the reality is that the bill was there, indisputably. And I kept spending. I used it to pay an old debt at the bakery, bought a new shirt, and even left some of the change in my wife's pocket without revealing its origin. At first, the situation amused me. It was like receiving an unexpected gift, a gap in life that finally helped me breathe. I used the note every day, seeing it as a personal blessing. It paid off debts, made my bills easier, and even provided me with some luxuries that I hadn't had for months. However, as the weeks passed, something sinister began to haunt my routine. Strange events occurred, and the lightness I felt before turned into fear. The first signs were so subtle that they almost seemed like coincidences. Simple objects in my house began to fall for no apparent reason. A glass, for example, would slide off the table and shatter, even though there wasn't even a breeze in the room. One night, while I was eating dinner, I saw the salt shaker slide on its own until it fell to the floor. I started to think that I might be inattentive, but the cold sensation that ran down my spine whenever this happened suggested otherwise. And as night fell, the manifestations became even worse. Noises echoed through the hallway, footsteps that didn't belong to me, creaks on the bedroom door, even though it was locked, and certain rhythmic taps on the wall, as if someone wanted to get my attention from the other side. My room, which was my sacred refuge, became almost unbearable to stay in. The atmosphere there seemed heavy, dense, as if something invisible was watching every movement. One morning, I woke up enveloped in a supernatural cold. It wasn't just the night breeze or a poorly closed window. It was a cold that had started in the floor itself, rising through my bones, oppressing me completely. I got up to examine it, and as I crossed the room, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The television was on, but it wasn't making any sound, just that monotonous black and white static. I remained motionless, feeling as if I was being watched by something anonymous in the darkness. I tried to believe it was an electrical fault, but when I looked away toward the bookshelf, I caught a glimpse of something, a tall, slender figure in a corner of the room made of darkness. I turned my head in surprise, but there was nothing there. My heart was beating so hard, I could almost hear it in my ears. Despite this, I tried to convince myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, a play of light and shadow. But I was wrong. Over the next few days, things got even worse. One night, while I was listening to the radio, it simply stopped working. I thought it was a power outage, but I realized that the radio wasn't even plugged in. It kept turning on and off on its own, sending out an incessant static that filled the air. It sounded like someone or something was messing with it. Later that night, while I was trying to fall asleep, I felt the weight of something sitting on the bed next to me. My lungs nearly stopped working. Frightened, I looked around the room, but there was no living soul there other than me. The room, however, was freezing cold, and I swear I heard a low laugh, very distant, almost inaudible, but real enough to steal my peace. Then the nightmares began. In my sleep, the image of Don Alvaro haunted me, pale as the day I placed him in the coffin, but with deep, hollow eyes and an excessively wide smile, as if he belonged to an entity, not a human. He always repeated the same words in a reverberating voice that hammered my conscience. "You appropriated what was mine. Now bear the price. I woke up screaming, my body drenched in sweat, while that disgusting echo still echoed in my mind. After one of those terrible dreams, I heard slow, heavy footsteps in the hallway, as if someone was dragging old boots across the floor. The noise stopped in front of my bedroom door, and my heart almost burst. I waited for something, a noise, a movement, but nothing happened. When I gathered the courage to check, I found the hallway empty. But on the floor, there were damp footprints, as if someone had just come in from the rain. From that moment on, my existence became a torment. I was exhausted, oppressed, always with the impression that I was no longer alone. One afternoon, while washing dishes, I felt an icy hand land on my shoulder. I was so startled that I dropped the plate, shattering it. When I turned around, I didn't see anyone, but the cold touch still felt like it was embedded in my skin. I was lost. My house was no longer mine, as if a hidden presence had decided to settle there, watching my every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. The feeling of being imprisoned by something that could not be seen was constant. And I knew very well when it all started, at that moment when I put the damned $100 bill in my pocket. One night, as I was trying to fall asleep, the laughter returned. It was coming from the darkest corner of the room, where the darkness seemed to be pulsing. I turned on the light, but I couldn't identify anything physical. However, my panic had already taken over. I had a feeling that it wouldn't end easily, and deep down, I was sure that Alvaro's spiteful spirit was responsible. I just had no idea how to break this bond. With each passing day, the feeling that my life was slipping away from my control intensified. The house that had once been my safe haven had now become a cage. I was just a puppet trapped in a curse that I had cultivated myself. And if there was anything that terrified me more than facing these macabre nights, it was what lay beyond them. Something told me that all of this was still just the beginning. The nightmares were repeated every night. The vision of Don Alvaro appeared constantly, pale complexion, sunken eyes, and a smile that practically tore his face apart. He repeated coldly, "You took what belonged to me. Now it's your turn." I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. Then, one night, I decided I had to put an end to this. I took the cursed note and headed to the necropolis, armed with a shovel. I dug Alvaro's grave under the dull light of the full moon, while the wind around me seemed to mock my actions. When I opened the coffin, the smell of death hit me full on, and the body already showed signs of putrefaction. But what really made me tremble were his eyes. God, those eyes seemed to watch me, as if they still held some trace of life. Without hesitation, I stuffed the note into his jacket pocket and muttered an apology. "I had no idea," I whispered. It was then that I felt something cold squeeze my arm. Terror froze my throat, making it impossible for me to scream, and the tears flowed freely. I dropped everything as it was, leaving the coffin open, and ran away without looking back. The next day, still shaken, I decided to look for Alvaro's family. I told them everything, feeling ashamed and afraid of their judgment. To my surprise, they weren't as shocked. His niece, with her face streaked with tears, told an even more chilling story. She said that Alvaro was, in fact, obsessed with money. Shortly before he died, he came across that same mysterious $100 note, which returned to him even after it was spent. Initially, he also thought it had brought him luck, but soon the frightening events began. The manifestations, the shadows, the tormented dreams. He spent days feeling a shadow haunting him, and, pressured by paranoia, his heart couldn't take it. Dying holding that note was the last scene the family witnessed. Not knowing what to do, they decided to bury the note next to him, believing that this would put an end to the haunting. But it didn't. The curse remained. Alvaro's niece, in tears, explained that the man, even after his death, seemed to not want to let anyone have peace. It was at that moment that I knew I was trapped. I had no idea how to escape. The nights then became even more macabre, the hauntings more and more powerful. I tried to get rid of the note by burning it, throwing it away, burying it in other graves, but it always ended up back in my pocket. Once again, I felt like I had no way out. At first, the note that seemed like a gift became a sinister chain, binding me to a dark destiny. I made countless attempts to destroy it. I burned it in the fireplace, watching the flames consume it completely, only to find it intact the next morning, resting in the same pocket of my uniform. I threw it into a river, watching it be swallowed up by the current. But the next day it was there again, as if mocking me. I even buried it in a forgotten grave, but it supernaturally returned from the earth. In the meantime, the terror intensified. What had previously been simple noises and shadows now began to have a physical effect. The shadows, previously hidden in the corners, began to approach, almost touching me. I felt the air around me freeze, as if invisible hands were reaching out to grab me. On several occasions, I felt something brush against my skin, an icy contact that made me let out choked screams in the middle of the night. The walls began to creak, as if they had a life of their own, bending around me. One morning I woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps on the ceiling. It couldn't be just rats or small animals. It sounded like someone was deliberately walking from one side to the other. I went out to check, but found nothing. My house had become a palpable nightmare. The television started to turn on by itself, always at night, showing disfigured and distressing images, pale faces, contorted figures that flickered between flashes before disappearing into static. The radio, even when turned off, played old melodies, full of hiss. Once while washing my face in the bathroom, I came across something hideous in the mirror. The reflection of Don Alvaro standing behind me with that wide smile and sunken eyes. I turned around with a start, but there was nothing there. However, the mirror began to crack right in the center. I no longer slept well, barely ate and couldn't concentrate on anything. My sanity hung by a thread, with my imagination becoming fertile ground for new scares. Even in absolute silence, I heard whispers and murmurs coming from impossible places, calling my name, repeating meaningless phrases, but always returning to the same sentence. You stole. Now pay the price. One night, unable to sleep, my soul exhausted, I reached my limit. I picked up an old revolver that I had inherited from my grandfather. It was rusty, but it still fired. I sat on the living room floor, the gun in my hand, as I listened to the constant rhythm of the beats on the wall. It seemed as if something invisible was having fun at my expense, mocking my desperation. I held the revolver tightly, pressing it to my chin. Tears flowed freely. I knew I was about to commit a desperate act, but I saw no other way out. I would rather end my life than continue to endure that evil presence. I closed my eyes, and between sobs, begged God for forgiveness. I begged for mercy for what I was about to do. I asked for absolution for my mistakes, the theft, my cowardice, my fear of facing things differently. My heart was pounding so hard that I could almost hear it thundering in my ears. Suddenly, a spark of an idea crossed my mind: the chapel. I remembered my mother's words, who always said that the divine house was a place where even the heaviest burdens could be left. Maybe, just maybe, that was the way out. I dried my tears, put away my revolver, and picked up the cursed $100 note. Trembling, I decided that I would go to the nearest chapel to donate that money, and with that, try to break the curse once and for all. It seemed absurd, but I had no choice. I ventured out of the house at dawn, the note in my pocket, which was radiating an ominous, almost living heat. Deep down, I was already aware that it would not be a peaceful journey. There was a force opposing my liberation. I walked through the dark streets in a silence so heavy that my own footsteps echoed in my ears. As soon as I turned the first corner, I felt the wind gain intensity, It was a peculiar breeze, blowing from all directions at once. The trees shook their branches as if to warn me of something, and the streetlights flickered non-stop, plunging the street into brief intervals of darkness. As I walked forward, I saw a beggar who usually slept motionless in front of an old ruined bakery. I knew his face by sight, but at that moment he was erect, staring at me. His eyes looked like two black vortices. "Don't go," he stammered in a scratchy voice. I stopped involuntarily. A chill ran down my spine. "What?" I asked, trying to think if it was just that poor man's delusion. "Don't step into the chapel," he repeated, now standing up. He seemed taller than usual, as if the darkness around him made him bigger. "You don't understand what you're about to do. If you do, he won't forgive you." I felt my heart jump in my chest, but I decided to ignore it, trying to move forward as quickly as possible. However, as I walked away, I could still hear his voice shouting, "You have no idea what you're invoking." I quickened my steps, struggling not to look back, but I was already overcome by fear. A few minutes later, thunder rumbled in the distance, announcing a storm, and soon the first drops fell. In moments, what had been a drizzle turned into a furious downpour. The water accumulated in the streets at a frightening speed, as if the clouds were pouring an ocean. My clothes were soaked and heavy, making it difficult to move. Mud dripped from the sidewalks, and the gutters gushed water instead of draining it. The sound of the rain was almost deafening, but still I could hear murmurs on the wind. They were not legible, but they sounded so full of anger that they overwhelmed me. Looking down the alleys, I noticed displaced shapes moving, certainly not people. They were ghostly silhouettes that slunk away, always out of my direct field of vision. With each step I took toward the chapel, they seemed to shorten the distance. In a flash, lightning tore through the sky, illuminating the empty street. For a brief moment, I saw something that froze my blood. A tall, disproportionate creature, standing in the center, staring at me. It was impossible to tell whether it was human or not, but its appearance was so oppressive that it almost made me retreat. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them, the figure had disappeared. However, the fear persisted, throbbing in every pore. By now, the water had risen to my ankles, and I was forced to struggle not to slip. The biting cold and the weight of my anguish only increased, making me believe that hidden forces really were trying to block my path. But I kept going, repeating soft prayers, begging for courage. My hands trembled, and the bill in my pocket burned brighter and brighter, as if it were alive and hated the idea of being discarded. When I finally glimpsed the chapel, it was almost a miracle to find it standing, with a few candles softly illuminating its stained glass windows. It was a refuge in the midst of chaos, a glimmer of hope. I tried to open the door, but a gust of wind pushed it against me, as if someone inside wanted to keep me out. I pushed with all my strength and finally managed to get inside, closing the door behind me as the storm raged outside. The interior was silent, but there was something heavy in the air. The note was still burning in my pocket, and as much as my leg hurt, I knew that this was where I had to do what I had to do. I knelt down, exhausted, and prayed. I whispered pleas for forgiveness and cried out for deliverance, begging the divine presence to break the chains that bound me to all that horror. As my prayer intensified, I felt a resistance, as if the air around me were moving uncomfortably. It wasn't just a feeling of heat, but of actual burning. I reached into my pocket to pull out the note, but the burning increased, almost making me drop it. Still, I looked up and advanced toward the altar. The candles in the chapel flickered violently, even though there was no apparent breeze. I had the impression that the entire room was watching me, as if evaluating my every step. I prostrated myself on one of the benches and began my requests for absolution again, begging God to accept my offering and free me from that entity. In the middle of my prayer, I heard soft footsteps behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. The chills on my back were unbearable, and I felt myself sinking with each passing moment. Still, I persisted. A little later, brothers from the chapel walked around with those collection bags, collecting donations. When they reached me, I hesitated. The note was still burning in my pocket, but I had to give it to them. With a trembling hand, I took out the money and put it inside. The moment I let go of the note, it felt like a huge rock had been lifted off my back. The heat disappeared and the pain dissipated. However, at the same time, something changed in the room. The candles began to go out and light up in sequence, as if an evil wind was sweeping them. The cold in the air intensified, and I heard a low sound, almost a roar, echoing through the walls of the chapel. I looked around, but no one but me seemed to notice. I closed my eyes, begging for this torment to come to an end. I left the chapel late at night with a sense of relief that I hadn't felt in a long time. Curiously, the storm outside had disappeared as if it had never existed, and the sky was clear with the moon shining brightly on the streets. The silence that reigned no longer terrified me. It was a silence of rest, as if the universe had restored some order to my life. I walked slowly, still trembling, but with a sigh of hope. Perhaps finally this had reached its limit. When I entered the house, I noticed that everything seemed different. The previously stifling atmosphere had dissipated, and there were no sounds of footsteps, shadows lurking, or any unwelcome presence. It was as if finally my house had become a home again. I took a hot shower, removing the cold and tension of that night, and lay down. The fear that used to prevent me from closing my eyes was gone, and for the first time in a long time, I felt protected. I fell asleep quickly, without having nightmares or dreams, just a deep and refreshing sleep. When I woke up, the sun was already shining through the window, bathing the room in golden light. I sat up in bed for a moment, tempted to doubt whether it had all been just a nightmare. It was then that anguish took hold of my chest again. I jumped out of bed, grabbed the uniform that was lying on the chair, and quickly felt my pocket, afraid of what I would find. My stomach tightened nervously. I turned the pocket inside out, but there was nothing. The note had not returned. I allowed myself a moment of uncertainty. The money that insisted on resurfacing, that would never let itself be discarded, had finally disappeared. I found it hard to believe, but slowly, a smile appeared on my lips. Finally, the curse had been broken. I went to the kitchen, leaving the uniform aside, and sat down. The house was silent, but this silence now was welcoming. The daylight seemed brighter, warmer. Everything seemed renewed, as if I were breathing a different air. Outside, the usual sounds of the city filled my ears. Cars, people, life rushing by. A normality that I didn't realize how much I had missed. I sighed deeply, thanking not only divine providence, but myself for not having given up in the midst of despair. I had done the right thing, even at the last second. That note, that money, that at first seemed like a gift from fate, taught me in the most terrifying way possible the depth of the abyss into which greed, even if involuntary, can throw us. And I would never forget that lesson. After that episode, I resumed my activities at the necropolis. I still witness emotional farewells, as well as the omnipresent melancholy that surrounds the graves. However, I never dared to touch anything that wasn't strictly mine. The experience transformed me completely. If you ever come across a $100 bill that looks too cheap to be true, my advice is simple. Don't touch it. Don't risk your fate, because the price could be terribly high.